Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you are new to the show, please smash that subscribe button. Also consider becoming a YouTube member, a Patreon, or donate a small amount given in the link in the description box. But the least you could do is to watch this show, like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest today, KJ No. KJ is a journalist, political analyst, writer, and educator specializing in the geopolitics and political economy of the Asia Pacific region. KJ, welcome back to India and Global Left.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you. And thank you for being flexible about time.
Of course, I wanted to discuss the implication or outcomes of the recent meeting between President Trump and President Xi. Um, Maybe before we take a deep dive into some of the deeper meanings, if you could spell out what are the highlights of the meeting that stood out for you, that would be great for our viewers.
Well, I think the key takeaway is that the US blinked. On the left, we should or we remind ourselves to tell no lies, claim no easy victories, because there are no easy victories. But this looks like a clear knockdown, not a knockout, but a knockdown. And it's really the moment when the bully realizes that it cannot bully anymore. So specifically, the U.S. had threatened to impose, had imposed fentanyl sanctions. It was threatening to impose further export controls, the so-called 50% rule, and to increase the number of sanctioned entities. And then it had levied port fees, these exorbitant port fees, along with many, many other kinds of very coercive measures. And it essentially withdrew all of them. It withdrew everything, and we're back down to the initial arrangement that was agreed to in Madrid. Now, just going back to Madrid, remember, this was the follow-up on trade talks in Geneva, London, Stockholm. And so this was the fourth set of discussions. And there was an agreement to manage differences through dialogue and cooperation, not coercion and confrontation. And as soon as that was over, the US put down these extraordinary restrictive measures targeting China, adding thousands of Chinese entities to the entity list, threatening, the 100% tariffs, unilateral port fees, etc. And they were also scrapping the de minimis rules. Items under $800 are exempt, etc. So all of these were so extraordinarily aggressive that China hit back, and it hit back hard. They didn't get angry; they simply reciprocated. And so this was the rare earth element controls. They were threatening these. And these also involved secondary controls and controls over processing equipment, etc. Very similar to what the US has been doing with its CHIPS Act and other controls. But when that happened, the US was stunned. They really not, I mean, not only did they blink, but they were stunned, and you could see the desperation. And so they took back their move. In chess, if you threaten a piece and then you take back your move, if you don't carry through, you've essentially lost that round. And essentially, that's what happened. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the US supply chain had a near death experience. It was weeks away from industrial collapse. And certainly the car industry was blinking, all signals red. And remember, the United States is built on the car industry. US is a car culture. If you ask an American, the first time they did everything was in a car. Life transitions happen in cars. You can get married in your car. The entire industrialization and urbanization of the United States was designed around cars. And so when you have the car industry threatening to collapse, not to mention the entire supply chain, then you know that, this is a really, really serious situation. And you can tell because everybody in the China Hawk class right now is angry, upset, or depressed. Michael Froman, he's the top dog of the top deep state think tank, the CFR, and he's furious. He's calling Trump an arsonist, and he's essentially destroyed U.S. Grand strategy towards China. So they're very angry, and when the deep state is furious, that things are moving in the right direction.
Part of this anger, frustration within the U.S. administration is due to their miscalculation about the strength and weaknesses of both the United States and China. I mean, prior to this economic warfare, we heard a lot about how big the U.S. consumer market is. We never heard about anything about the size of the Chinese consumer market. I mean, now we began to hear about Chinese consumer market, be it the soybeans or be it the Nvidia chip market. Likewise, we never heard anything about, and by we I mean the mainstream media never told anything. Of course, those of us who've been following it closely knew about it. People are now knowing more about the Chinese strength in rare earth batteries and so on. If you could give us, given this is called by most analysts, and I think they are correct, as a tactical detente rather than a strategic reset, which is, in layman's language, is a very short-term kind of truce rather than a long-term repairing of relationship. Going forward, if you could tell our viewers, what are the structural strengths and weaknesses of both United States and China when they are competing against each another? That I think would be helpful.
Well, the US still has a structural strength in its military. It has structural strength, if we can call it that, in its financial system. It has a near monopoly over the global financial system. And it's a highly financialized economy. And then it has, tremendous strength in its PR and propaganda apparatus. In fact, I would say that its greatest strength, the United States' greatest strength, is its PR, advertising, propaganda, indoctrination apparatus. I would argue that it controls both the backbone and the algorithms of the global information sphere. And essentially, the US's greatest power is the power to mindfuck everybody. That is what it is really ultimately, the grand, that's its grand, superpower. But in terms of the miscalculation, the US has deeply and fundamentally miscalculated around tariffs because tariffs are not a threat to China. Essentially, you have to understand that China exports goods to the United States, and the U.S. exports paper to China. It exports dollars to China. That's the trade imbalance. And the US always considered that because it had a large consumer market, that it had the upper hand. China was beholden to it. This is absolutely wrong because money is fungible. Paper money is fungible, but goods are rarely fungible except in certain circumstances, right? And so when you need a good, a specific resource, that may or may not be replaceable, whereas China can simply export elsewhere, which is what it has been doing. Now, even structurally, economically, China was doing about 13% of its exports to the United States. It's dropped considerably. And that is about maybe 2% of China's GDP. In other words, the amount or the surplus that it was, generate, the amount that it was exporting to the United States is less than the contribution of a single major Chinese city to the GDP. Shanghai easily outclasses Chinese exports to the United States. And so from that standpoint, if you did the arithmetic, I'm not talking about difficult math, if you just did the arithmetic, you would see that it was not that material. But since the US imposed the tariffs, China simply pivoted and it's increased its exports to other countries significantly. It's decreased its exports to the United significantly, and its trade surplus has gone up, and its economy is still firing strong. And so that lets you know that the United States is not material. It didn't have the strength that it thought it had with the tariff threat. And, 100%, 145% tariffs, these are absolutely nonsense. But we also have to go back to the understanding that this tariff war started with the first Trump administration, and it was planned in two phases. And China capitulated a little bit in the phase one tariffs. But what it did was it prepared for Trump's return and a second round of tariff wars. And essentially, when you're in a tariff war or a kinetic war or a hybrid war, war is essentially a contest of learning curves, right? The side that learns faster wins. The side that doesn't learn, that doesn't adapt, loses. But when the US came out, it came out with the same plan. That definitional insanity of doing the same thing and expecting different results. By that time, China had already been well prepared, and it had prepared several powerful counter moves. And so when the United States, came out swinging with its tariffs, and of course, this time it was even worse because they were scattershot, machine gunning everybody, including all their allies with tariffs. China, simply responded rapidly. It ducked, and then it put the United States into a chokehold. And that chokehold was regarding rare earth elements. And the US very rapidly had to tap out. I mean, literally, it was a near-death experience. And if you want me to get into why rare earth elements are irreplaceable, I can also explain why.
Of course, yes. Given the rare art has been so much in the news, and something that you referred to earlier about the US auto industry being at the verge of collapse and its dependence on the rare earth, Chinese batteries, etc. If you could tell our viewers the centrality of rare earth in the supply chain of production, that would be, of course, very helpful.
Well, I think the first thing to understand is that, you know, Besant believes that the Chinese rare earth advantage will last only 1 to 2 years. He said the Chinese spent 25, 30 years building it, but we will do it in 1 to 2 years. Now, I would say that that is a form of insanity. I mean, that's foolishness verging on insanity. And the reason for that is that China spent not 30 years, actually 5 decades building out its rare earth element system, its industrial refining and production of rare earth elements. It goes back to 1972. And the first thing to understand about rare earth elements is that rare earth elements have unique properties. That is paramagnetism, anti-magnetism, heat-resistant magnetism, if you alloy them, luminescence, lightness, etc. And that has to do with what is called, basic chemistry, F block orbital structure of the electron shells. And there is no technology on the planet that allows us to meaningfully manipulate the electron shells or mimic those properties. In other words, you need those elements as opposed to, say, chips, which you can develop. Therefore, the only way to get rare earth elements is to mine them, refine them, and process them. And you could also recycle them from existing components, but that's actually very, very hard because of the way that they're made, they're not easily recyclable. Now, the thing to understand is that they're incredibly hard to refine. And military grade rare earth elements are even harder to refine. But, once again, rare earth elements are called lanthanides or lanthanoids. And this comes from the Greek word lanthanine, which means hidden, latent, obscure. And that's because they're incredibly hard to separate and they're not found in meaningful concentration. The most common of the lanthanides, cerium and lanthanum, they're found in concentrations of about 60 and 30 parts per million in the Earth's crust. And to give you a point of reference, that's about the concentration of iron in your body. We have hemoglobin in the blood, etc. So we have iron in the body. So the amount of concentration of rare earth elements in the Earth's crust is about the level of concentration of iron in the human body. And then that's the most common ones. And the rarer ones are as low as 1% of those numbers. And so refining a usable amount of metal from these levels of concentration, that's like building a car from refining human cadavers or refining human plasma, or like trying to build a house from bricks that are made from the dirt that you wash out of your jeans. Every time you wash your jeans, there's a bit of dirt, right? I mean, if you do that enough, refine it enough, you could ostensibly build, a house, but it's incredibly complex. It's incredibly repetitive. It's incredibly energy intensive, and it is incredibly costly, incredibly costly. And so, China has this 90+% monopoly, not just on the processing, but the processes involving rare earth elements. And, American pundits, they like to opine that China got a monopoly because it has lax environmental regulation. This is simply the racist slur of dirty Chinese applied as cope. They got control over rare earth elements because they got dirty. But actually, one of the key innovations of the Chinese over a 5-decade process was to make the refining cleaner and safer, as well and purer. And they hold all the patents on that. So it's not easy. And then the other thing to understand is that rare earth elements are the key pillar of the US defense industry. That is to say, radar, guidance, navigation, targeting, joint arms interoperability, the entire networked battlefield is reliant on rare earth element related magnets, lasers, electronics. So it is really, really, a significant blow or threat to the United States. In fact, Scott Bessent refers it to a sword. He calls it the sword of, i.e., a sword of Damocles hanging over the United States. He says we can get out from under it in a few years, but he understands that it is a critical sword. And the other thing is the timing of this, because remember, the US has depleted its military magazine because of its recent wars against Iraq, because of its recent and continuing genocide against the Palestinians, and because of the continued war in Ukraine. So it's depleting its magazine. And in order to rebuild that, all of those systems need rare earth elements, hundreds of pounds to tons, depending on the weapons platform. And it just doesn't have the reserves or even the supply chain. So that is why it's so threatening. But the other thing to understand is Besant and many, many pundits seem to think that, we'll just reindustrialize. But you and I know that that's not going to happen, right? It's not possible because the US has deindustrialized over 50 years. During the same process China was industrializing, the US has deindustrialized over half a century. And we know the logic of this. Monopoly capital financializes. It's a one-way street in the capitalist roadmap. And there's no way to turn the clock back. You cannot swim backwards against the traffic, against the time, against the tide, unless the United States does what China did, you know? I mean, very simply, you know, General Motors is a US car manufacturing company, but actually what it mostly does is it sells loans rather than make cars. That's where its major business is. You know, you buy an Apple computer, they'll offer you an installment plan. In the United States, if you buy a burrito, you know, a wrap sandwich, they will ask you if you want to put it on 4 easy installments, right? And so that's even, you know, your lunch that you're ordering is becoming financialized. That tells you two things. Everything is being financialized. And it also tells you the working classes are being so immiserated that they have to borrow money in order, go into debt in order to have lunch. And so this is the inexorable logic of capitalism. You know, money generates commodities, generates M prime, more money, has shifted into money generates more money, or money simply claims more money, M to M prime. This is the structure that we're living in. And this is not something that can be undone. You cannot wind the clock back unless, and let's think about this, you know, people say, I mean, let's think about China. What China did was it implemented elements of market capitalism in order to be capital at its own game. Now, the question is, can US capitalism implement socialism to compete with China? Because that's what it will need to do if it wants to reindustrialize. And technically, yes. You know, of course, we know, as we said, monopoly corporations don't compete in markets, but they plan. And that planning is similar to what could technically occur, you know, in a socialist plan system. But unfortunately, what they plan, or more accurately, what they scheme for, is things that are undesirable. They produce social bads. They plan for social bads, not social goods. And so that's the problem. And of course, technically, there's nothing to say that they couldn't be taken over by the state as public utilities once they hit that monopoly stage. I mean, I think there's a good argument to say that, you know, these social media companies should become public utilities. But in practice, there is no political will and no political power that can make that happen short of a revolution. So in practice, no. And then the other thing to understand, and I always emphasize this, is that the US has not simply de-skilled. It has not simply deindustrialized, it has de-skilled. That is, it has made everybody dumb and stupid. And that's what capitalism does. And you know, 300 years ago, the father of capitalism, Adam Smith, he predicted this. He said, he talked about the mental mutilation caused by the division of labor in capitalism. And he said, a person would become as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human being to become. This is what he warned against, right? And we just recently saw these statistics. You know, IQ has dropped. It, you know, drops 1 point every 4 years or something. Only 5% can do what 25% could do in 1994. You know, when I teach in university or graduate school, I see this. You know, the writing, the reasoning, the literacy levels drop every single year. And you can see this kind of de-skilling and this kind of creation of a population of poorly educated, ignorant people. But as I said, you know, under capitalism, de-skilling and dumbing down of the population is actually necessary, right? Because first you want to make jobs and employees fungible. They can be easily replaced, precarious. And so you want that absolute fungibility and de-skilling. And it also ensures compliance and discipline because everybody knows they're immediately replaceable. And then the second thing is you also want to prevent critical thinking that would challenge the system. So you want stupid people. So, the system is a system that creates and it thrives and it, sustains itself on ignorance, illiteracy, and stupidity. And on the other hand, for example, compared with China, Chinese spend 4 times on education what they spend on their military. In the US, it's the other way around, right? But we know that socialism requires intelligent, educated people. It requires people who can think critically, who are transdisciplinary thinkers, who are creative, and it values human development. Socialism needs and breeds intelligent people, whereas capitalism needs and breeds exploitable people. And for that, it requires human underdevelopment. It requires human stupidity. It needs people to be disempowered, cowed, exploitable, and uh, easy to abuse. And that's why, that's the core contradiction. And that's the thing that people like Besant or Froman will never address. And so, yeah, it's not going to happen in 1 or 2 years. And I doubt that it's even going to happen in 5 to 10 years.
And what do you think could be the response of the ruling elites to this defeat? I mean, in many ways, the United States has seen a economic rival who can impose material and economic damage on the United States. Uh, i- for maybe even century, for more than a century, it hasn't seen such a rival, and it has seen such for the first time, and it effectively exposes the lies of U.S. capitalism or neoliberal capitalism. I mean, first leg of that expose happened during the global financial crisis, but I would see this round as an extension and more deepening of that crisis, because if the global financial crisis was to some extent a financial crisis, of course linked to the housing crisis, and it did impact a lot in terms of the material conditions of those homeowners. But nevertheless, this was packaged as a financial crisis. But this time, this involved trade, this involved technology transfer, this involved labor, and we are seeing escalations against H1B. It involves all kinds of aspects of society and economy. And the US failed. I mean, Donald Trump rose to power by riding on the discontentment of globalization and neoliberal capitalism, of course, by spilling out lies. And I expect them to spill out more lies this time. What do you think would be the way forward in terms of the ruling elites are concerned, and how should the U.S. citizens respond to this crisis?
So those are two really, really good questions. I mean, the US ruling elite are making noises about creating a stable relationship and a modus vivendi. I believe that is not honest. I don't believe that is sincere. If you dig very, very shallowly under their language, you will see that they're still very, very much wedded to their idea of hegemony and dominance. An addict doesn't give up their addiction easily. And the US addiction is an addiction to power, it's an addiction to hegemony. I mean, it's essentially, we know, the Western imperial empires are built on an extractive core periphery relationship, and they extract trillions of dollars of wealth and hundreds of billions of hours of labor time out of the global south for free every year. And, Jason Hickel has done really good work on this. He's quantified some of it. He's, in one estimate, it's between 60 and 150 trillion dollars gotten for free from the global south since 1960. Another way of calculating it is, for example, in, every year, about 800 billion hours of free labor comparable to $17 trillion worth of labor by Western salaries. And all of this is done through neocolonial, neoliberal means, right? Unequal treaties, foreign ownership of sovereign resources, extractive loans, IP monopoly, monopoly rents, the reserve currency, that exorbitant privilege. And all of this is backstopped by the threat of violence. Now, if the US gives up on being an empire and just is an equal in the global scheme of things, it gives up on all those free goods. It's like a parasite becoming a worker bee. It's like the rickshaw passenger is now pulling the rickshaw. It's like Puyi, the last emperor, becoming a gardener. Okay, that doesn't happen easily. In the case of Puyi, it took a revolution and then 10 years, a decade of re-education. And so the question is, can the West make that readjustment? Can they eat bitter for generations like the Chinese? Are they willing to work in factories? Will the elites allow this? Can the addict kick its power habit? Or as I've said before, you know can they give up can they give up their control over the planet? And I've said that they would rather destroy. My belief is that the ruling imperial elite would rather destroy the planet than give up their power and privilege. But we have to we'll see. It's I think that there is a lot of recalibration going on. And if you look at Western media, they're saying that China is no longer subordinate, it is an equal. We have to come to grips with that. And then once again, people like Michael Froman, he's saying, in this very, very angry article in the Council in Foreign Relations, he's saying, celebrating the arsonist. He says that we have to. He says that ultimately only a change in China's behavior will stabilize the bilateral relationship. And what he's talking about is essentially China has to change its system. So they really haven't given up, and they're really not looking for a real modus vivendi. I think what we're looking at is a tactical reset, a tactical recalibration while they kind of assess the battle damage and try to put themselves back together for another cycle. And this is why Besant keeps on saying, oh, this is just a temporary setback, 1 or 2 years, we'll recover, and then we'll be fine. And Froman is saying, we need to continue to build economic and military coalitions to deter, meaning aggress, and outpace, meaning dominate, subjugate China. So I don't think there's a change in the mindset, but there is certainly discontent, there's certainly depression, and there's certainly anger.
And I guess this has to do a lot with imperial mindset, this desperation about not giving up imperial privileges. I mean, this also resembles feudal privileges. But I was struck by what President Xi Jinping said. I mean, they have been saying this all the while, but he reiterated that. The strategy or the goal of Chinese rejuvenation is not necessarily inconsistent with a reasonable, he said, America first policy, by which he means that making America great again. I mean, not in the way Trump says it, but genuine development of United States is not inconsistent with the genuine development of Chinese, and so they don't necessarily see things in the zero-sum game. But that's not how the American elites see it. They see any rise of China as a loss or as a cost to the imperial ambition and footprint of the United States. And something very important in this meeting is also the absence. I mean, you have referred to some of the things that came up during the talk. Um, cutting down of 20% fentanyl related tariff to 10%, effectively bringing down the tariffs from 57 to 47, still significantly higher, taking down some of those fees relating to the shipping industry, and also some of the non-tariff restrictions, as you mentioned. But to at least one noteworthy absence was Taiwan in this meeting. And this was minutes before Trump announcing that the United States was restart nuclear testing, not just of weapons delivery, which it has been doing all the while, but also nuclear testing itself. So the Trump camp and the American elites are still not coming to terms with the historical fact that Taiwan, China is part of China, and they are still ready to go on a war if they like over Taiwan. Uh, what's your sense of the geopolitical side of the U.S.-China relationship that, of course, didn't come on these talks, but are looming large?
Yes. Once again, this is a very, very, very important comment. And, once again, um, you're absolutely correct. The US elites see their relationship with China as zero sum. In fact, Kurt Campbell, addressed a whole bunch of Chinese diplomats, and he said to their face, they were talking about win-win. He said, "Your win-win is bullshit," which is, just in terms of diplomatic decorum, that is kind of an insane thing to say. But this is also the man who said that he would unleash a magnificent symphony of death in Asia. He said this publicly. So this tells you what the ruling imperial elite think, and what they are, basically oriented towards. The nuclear test just before the meeting is very, very interesting, because this is a kind of messaging that the U.S. always does before they meet. And you saw this very clearly with the Biden administration. Before they meet, they do something incredibly aggressive. During the meeting, they make nice noises, and then immediately or not long after the meeting, they re-escalate again. It's a Jekyll and Hyde behavior. It's good cop, bad cop routine. And I believe that it is actually part of the US diplomatic toolkit. It comes out of their counterinsurgency doctrine, which they have been developing for 20 plus years out of CNAS. And essentially, it's that old notion that you play Jekyll and Hyde. You play games with the person you're trying to dominate. You give them flowers one day, chocolates another, and then you give them beatings another day. And it's chocolates and beatings, flowers and beatings, back and forth, so that this is a way of kind of demoralizing, confusing, and undermining them. It's, I think McMaster, I think he had the best expression of it when he said, what we do is we go in and we are polite, we are professional, and we have a plan to kill everybody. That's the kind of counterinsurgency, psychological warfare strategy put into a nutshell. And so, for example, when President Trump met with Xi Jinping at Mar-a-Lago, 6 years ago, in the middle of dinner, when they were having this, according to him, this sumptuous and luxurious chocolate cake, they fired missiles into Syria and whispered that into Xi Jinping's ear. As he's eating the chocolate cake, he tells him, we just bombed Syria, and idea is, we're going to make him choke on the chocolate cake. And you can see an echo of that by, just before you go into meetings with China, you say you're going to resume nuclear testing. Now, the problem with that is that the US is actually no longer capable of doing nuclear testing, at least not for years. It simply doesn't have the capacity or ability. It's that constant de-skilling that I mentioned has also translated into, nuclear testing. And everything is done through simulations now. They don't have the capacity, to do an underground test or even an above ground test or whatever. And even if they did, it would take them years to get ready, and they'd have to get all their old engineers out of retirement and, have them start working again. But it does speak to you both the schizophrenia and the continued attempt to wage psychological warfare, which is another signal why they haven't changed their spots. They have been temporarily defanged, they've been temporarily declawed. Their claws have been taken out with the rare earth element threat, but they still haven't changed. And ultimately, the final ace or the final backstop is nuclear war. I believe that they're capable and willing to wage nuclear war. And so then all of that comes down to, for example, let's talk about the tariffs. The tariffs are supposedly 47%. But remember, you have to average out their tariffs because there's so many exemptions involved. And if you look at the actual effective rate of tariffs, it's probably about 27.8, according to the Yale Budget Review. And if you take 10% out for the quote unquote, fentanyl discount, then China is facing an effective tariff rate of 17.8%, which is actually, relative to other countries, including US allies, is reasonable. I mean, Japan had to give up 550 billion for that to get that discounted rate.
Brazil
Korea,
and India are facing much higher anyway.
much, much higher rates, right? So the US is, bullying its allies or potential allies at the same time that it is trying to make nice with China. And that is, again, as I said, because of the near death experience that it had regarding rare earth elements. But the other thing to understand is China has not lifted the control over military rare earths. Those were imposed in April of last year, the six heavy military or dual use rare earth elements. Those are still under strict control. And I seriously doubt that China is going to release control of them because it knows what the US is planning. Right now, the US is in a difficult place because it has depleted its magazine with 3 wars or 2 wars and a genocide, and it needs to build back as soon as possible, but it's reliant on the Chinese supply chain to do that. China is not going to give them that. And they explicitly said that we have to, for reasons of national security, we are controlling rare earth elements. And although there is a 1-year reprieve or 1 year of probation for the United States, during that period, China is simply going to tighten its administrative procedures. So the next time this comes around 1 year later, it's just going to be that much stronger and more stringent. And so I think that, the US is in a weak place. You can also see that China is putting pressure on US vassals and allies. For example, Hanwha is a Chinese munitions company. They sometimes refer to it as the McDonnell Douglas of Asia. But it is the quartermaster. It's the Asian quartermaster to the Ukraine war, and the Chinese have put sanctions on them. And I don't believe that they have been released or that they will be released because they had colluded with the United States to sanction China. So Hanwha, the Korean munitions company, is in deep trouble. It's certainly the US subsidiaries are. And then Nexperia, the Chinese company that was in the Netherlands, did this kind of hostile takeover and tried to steal this Chinese-owned corporation through, emergency measures. And the Chinese have essentially, told them to go F themselves. They're going to do all the production in China, and the the Netherlands is left holding this shell of a company. And it's like when you have conjoined twins, and you separate them, one of them is going to get the heart, and the other one is not. And the Dutch have decided that they're going to double down on their decoupling with China, and they're going to pay very, very deeply. These are very, very foolish moves. But what they don't understand is that when the bully is frustrated, he's going to take his frustration out on his sidekicks first. If he can't bully, the target, he will bully the sidekick. And so now the Dutch are going to get it, and the other allies are going to get it. And Japan has had to cough up $550 billion for the US. Korea was being extorted for 350. They negotiated that down. But all of this is to say that the US is turning against its allies. As Kissinger said, it is dangerous to be an enemy of the United States and fatal to be an ally. And they're all starting to see that and realize that. So, in the current moment, there is a tactical resetting, but I think the bloodshed has not ended, and that bloodshed will be felt all around the US allies. They need to understand that they need to do things differently. Just to give you kind of a historical context, in the 1920s, the African American community built a thriving city that was often referred to as the Black Wall Street. This was, where you had African American hospitals and law firms and doctors and dentists. And it was a thriving, rich community. And the white community burned this down to ashes. They killed at least 300 people, injured thousands, and they burnt it down to ashes. Why? Well, the pretext was there was an African American man who had looked the wrong way at an elevator operator, and they wanted to punish him. But really, they simply could not stand the idea of Black wealth. How could these Black people, how could these African Americans, our former slaves, become lawyers and doctors and dentists and, have their own economy? They need to be subjugated to us. And that is the same mindset the US was bringing to China. It wanted to raise China, burn it down to the ground, like they did in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in the Tulsa massacres. But China has shown that they will not be bullied, that they cannot be bullied. And the US is stepping back from that. And still, they haven't given up on that. I believe that they're hiding and biding and looking for other ways to attack. If not Venezuela, then Nigeria, then some other country. Look for more countries to destabilize and overthrow, especially in China's periphery. See if they can create this kind of lawless gangster capitalism all around China's periphery. Remember, Myanmar has reverted to kind of this criminal slave trade gangster capitalism, with the slave-run online scams. And this is just really this kind of core reversion to primitive accumulation, to sheer gangsterism, which we saw for example, in Manchukuo, and then in throughout Myanmar, but also in many, many stages of early capitalist development. It's reverted to that. And so, I think that, the gloves are off. They're going to just look for other ways and other means of trying to undermine the rising multipolar global South. And the role, I believe, of people in the global North is first to prevent the United States and the Western countries from going to war, because that is the backstop. That is what they're planning on. And then the second thing is, and this is more subtle but more difficult, is they have to degauss and decolonize their minds, because the US considers the mind to be a battlefield They see that the most important thing is to have narrative dominance so that they can start to, you need information dominance or narrative dominance before you can engage in kinetic war. And so if you can prevent that kinetic dominance, that colonization of the mind, that manufacturing of consent for war, that manufacturing of hatred for war, then you have a chance of preventing the actual kinetic war. And so then this is where media becomes really important, especially alternative media like yours. And I noticed there are sections or sectors of the quote unquote alternative media that are generating hatred for the global South, attacking BRICS, attacking China, attacking all the countries of the global South. Why aren't they doing something? They need to be more aggressive. They are doing something. They're working at their own pace. They're building out their pawn structure. They're not going to dive headfirst, into an aggressive gambit and sacrifice their queen. They're building out their pawn structure and they're moving it forward slowly. 15 pawn moves as an opening. But when that's done and it's getting more and more solid, then they will respond appropriately. And this is what you see with China's rare earth element response. They feel strong and solid enough that they can come out with a very, very strong response. And the US is standing up and taking notice. Ultimately, what the global North has to do is it has to support the sovereign, socialist, and progressive experiments in the global South rather than attacking them, because that's where hope and possibility are arising. There are multiple experiments, they're all different, but there is something that is organically and foundationally transformative that is happening. It's potentially the transformation of 500 years of Western colonialism and imperialism. That is an optimistic possibility. But if from the West you simply join and collaborate and you find yourself repeating CIA and State Department tropes, then you certainly are part of the problem, not part of the solution. Ultimately, I believe what the West needs to do is it needs to change its system. As I said, a socialist system develops humans. A capitalist system exploits humans. So what the global North needs to do is it needs to stop telling itself lies, stop deluding itself, and the people of the global North need to change their system in whatever way is possible, but starting with the refusal to buy into lies and to repeat, the propaganda narratives that are designed to overthrow possible and, promising movements of the global South.
That's a good way to end. But if I could ask one final question, given how important I find your comment about this, the need to build solidarity across a global South, and like you, I see that there are silver linings across the global South. We are seeing in West Asia, particularly, new ways of thinking about relationships between the Arab world and Iran, for instance, given there is a large recognition in the region that the primary threat is the Zionist empire and the US empire collectively. And some of these traditional divisions within West Asia have to be buried if they were to survive against the empire. We are also seeing the new president, I guess, in within the KMT in Taiwan, who has promised about a century of cross-strait peace a few days ago. President Lee in South Korea is under a very serious situation, right? I mean, the 350 billion US dollar investment would lead to a tremendous collapse. I mean, South Korea's forex reserve amounts to about $400 billion. That would be like more than 90% of, if that is to flow at one go, which is just impossible. I mean, South Korea is saying that 200 billion might flow in terms of tranches of $10 billion, and over and above that they will have some 50-50 ownership in shipbuilding and so on and so forth. But these are like, uh, if 350 billion is forced and extracted like tribute out of South Korea, it will extinguish the Korean economy. And this is just to place in the context of how, on one hand, China is able to withstand the imperial assault almost single-handedly. Although I don't want to minimize the kind of allies that China has also built in, but the United States, largely on paper, have much more allies. But the rest of the global South is also facing the brunt. We have seen this in the case of India, in Brazil, and so on and so forth. And so, given this reality, and given much of the rest of the non-Western world don't have the strengths of China, it's all the more important to connect, to live, as you said on our last program, to build solidarity, to resist the imperial course. So I want to close this by asking you about what are your thoughts about, as an observer from the West, what are your thoughts about the responses of the rest of the global South, not China, but the rest of the global South, to this madness of late imperial capitalism?
Well, for the vast majority of the people, I think the mask has fallen off. If it was ever, intact, they're seeing right through it. They see the fundamental bankruptcy of the imperial system and its claim to universality. Remember, the West has always claimed, this kind of universality of its morality and of its standards across the entire world. And it asserted, the end of history. Now, China broke with that because it developed on its own terms. Traditionally, the doctrine was, the doxa was, if you develop, you have to become more Western. If you want to become modern, you have to become more Western. You have to become more capitalist, neoliberal capitalist. And you have to, and this is the other thing that China has exploded, is your industry becomes more carbon intensive. And China has exploded all three of these things as myths. You don't have to become Western. You can develop on your own terms in a way that is appropriate for your own culture. In the case of China, socialism with Chinese characteristics. You do not have to become capitalist. You can develop in a way that is most appropriate for your system and your people. And you do not have to become more carbon intensive. China's carbon consumption has peaked. It's always been, a creditor nation in terms of its total carbon emissions, because total emissions is what matters, not annual emissions, not daily emissions. Carbon dioxide, once it is released into the atmosphere, lasts from 300 to 1,000 years. So you always have to look at the cumulative amount. And if you look at the cumulative amount and China's fair share of it relative to its size, it has always been a creditor nation. It has always used less than its actual budget. But even so, China has made promises to decarbonize, and it is starting to decarbonize. It has already, hit peak carbon emissions, and it's going down, and it's creating global goods so that all countries of the global South can develop sustainably. Essentially, it's turning sustainable development and sustainable technology into a global good so that you can tap into the global commons of the sun and the wind and the waves. The Western capitalist cannot enclose the sun and the wind and the waves. And therefore, China has given a method and a way for all the countries of the global South now to develop in terms of their energy infrastructure in sustainable ways. That is an extraordinary, revolutionary development. And of course, you never hear about it in the West, but it is fundamental. And if only for that thing alone, I believe that, the global South understands the benefits that China is bringing the world. And they have seen through the absolute bankruptcy of the Western imperial system and its pretensions to universal morality, even as it was built upon genocide upon genocide upon genocide, culminating with the current genocide, which they are telling you is not happening. That utter, total, hypocritical moral bankruptcy, I think, has been a wake up call for the entire world. And I think that this is also affecting, U.S. allies and vassals. South Korea, did not go along with the Trump program. They fought back. Japan has. Taiwan is now, the opposition party is talking about bridging relations and building strong relations with China. The DPP, Lai Ching-te, William Lai, has been criticized in the Western media as a reckless and a loose cannon, and so we can see even among Western vassals that the messaging is shifting, and certainly the people are understanding things in a completely different way. I think there is hope and optimism simply because of the transformative changes that are happening in the global South, uh, ushered in and strongly held together by China's example.
We'll leave it there, Kedze. This was a fascinating conversation, and it was an absolute honor to have you on. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. The last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.